to talk to you today a little bit about changing perspectives, how giver-centric generosity can transform your church funding. And that giver-centric generosity concept is something that we are finding is becoming more and more popular in the not-for-profit circles, and we want to try to introduce our church friends to that concept today. Joining me is David Thurman. He is the CEO and co-founder of Mortarstone. David, how are you doing today?
I'm good, sir. How are you? How is everyone else on this call? Good to see everybody.
Hope you guys are as well as David and I are today. So David, what we want to do is interact a little bit about the blog post that we released earlier this month. And we want to hit some of the highlights to help our churches and our church partners really begin to comprehend a little bit about what giver-centric or donor-centric philanthropy really means. So David, why don't you begin by just kind of sharing a little bit about what is giver-centric philanthropy or giver-centric generosity? What is it about that we need to know that is important?
Yeah, great. By the way, great blog, Timothy. You wrote a nice blog. All right, what is giver-centric generosity? And I'll start with this. We refer to our constituents in the church as givers, whereas in a non-faith nonprofit, they might refer to them as donors. There's a subtle distinction, but we don't think the people that support our ministries are donors. But that is the root of what we're talking about today, is called donor-centered philanthropy. And we've just kind of spun it to our vernacular as we teach churches. But giver-centric generosity or philanthropy is basically when you take the appeal away from the donor and you basically approach it as, hey, what are things that you would like to see accomplished, and how can you get behind those both with your time, talents, and treasures? Whereas if you contrast that with maybe a traditional church funding, there might be an appeal to fund the general fund or to fund a capital campaign. And so we would say that's church-centric fundraising, and then donor-centered fundraising would be, hey, what are the things that you, Mr. Donor, you, Mr. Giver, that you're passionate about that you might want to lean into with some of the resources that you steward for him?
Yeah, that's a great response. And David, as we think about kind of the modern trajectory or the landscape of generosity, why do you think that becoming giver-centric versus church-centric, why is that becoming more and more important as we think about kind of the current philanthropic landscape, not just in the church world, but in across all not-for-profits? Why is that really important now for us to really kind of begin shifting our thinking in how we approach our givers?
Yeah. And I'm going to caveat this, and I'm going to say it very carefully. We don't want to abandon what the church does, which in essence teaches a tithe. It teaches an income-based gift. And whether you're a tither or if you're growing into a tither and you're a percentage giver, that's all fine and well, but to the most part, that is focused both from church messaging to teaching around an income-based gift. And where we have made a big pivot to say, churches also need to think about the bigger bucket of assets that people steward. And those are what you call non-cash assets. So if you have your cash bucket, that's usually a tithing, give to the church, fund the church, tithe to the church, that sort of thing. And that's pretty much a straight appeal. And we do so as Christ followers to be obedient. But when we shift that perspective to a donor-centered piece, that then becomes a conversation around, we want people to think through their bigger bucket of assets when they start to think about their overarching generosity, not just their income-based giving or their tithing, but also that big bucket. And that obviously is theologically grounded as well. But that takes on a different piece, because now we're asking people to give from their estate which becomes more personal to somebody. And it's a journey they start to go on. And so we then need to start to approach it to say, hey, what are the things that you care about in our ministry, the things that we're accomplishing both in our church, locally, globally? What are the things that you care about? What are the things that, from a ministry perspective, that maybe break your heart that you want to lean into and get behind? Is it children? Is it sex trafficking? Is it, poverty? Is it fill in the blank, right? It's basically our mission purpose. But what are those things that we can start to articulate that then you can start to think through that break your heart? And we would frame this around two key concepts. What are you grateful for and what breaks your heart? And then that's really the compelling piece of why people start to give to the church.
Okay. So in many of our churches, if not all of them, have conducted capital campaigns. And in fact, David, I think it'd be important for you to take a minute and share that a capital campaign was kind of the initial genesis to the creation of Mortarstone in your experience as a high capacity lay leader. But how would we distinguish this approach from being church-centric to giver-centric? How does that fit in relationship to, for example, a capital campaign? Are we talking about a ministry that is like that, or is this something more ongoing?
Yeah. First, let me contrast that. Capital campaigns typically have a fundamentally different approach to their strategy than, say, outright giving or giver-centered philanthropy. What I mean by that is capital campaigns usually are focused around a project that they're trying to achieve funding for. Could be a capital project, could be debt reduction, could be fill in the blank, right? But it's a project that usually has a financial goal associated with it, and then it usually has a project timeline around it. And so those three elements distinctly make it church-centered fundraising. You're going to go make an appeal, even if you do that in a broad-based weekend sermon series. You're going to make an appeal to say, hey, we're trying to fill in the blank, achieve this. Would you be perfectly considering a gift by this date and or pledge over and above your annual giving to the church to fulfill that strategy, if you will? That's church-centered fundraising, if you will. Donor-centered fundraising takes that approach and slightly spins it a little bit to where it becomes that same capital campaign brochure, for lack of a better word, becomes a case for support, but it becomes more of an evergreen document. It basically is the tenets, the major tenets of what the ministry is about and wanting to achieve. Case in point, Habitat for Humanity. They do a brilliant job of laying out why they're in business and what problems they're trying to solve with people's giving to their organization. Churches don't do a very good job in general quantifying the problems they're looking to tackle. Rather, they lay it out as a quote unquote ministry to say, hey, we're just trying to get more and better disciples for Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. But if you want to think through a donor-centered piece of that, you have to broaden that to something that they can get behind and say, this is what I'm passionate about.
So then we're really looking to connect the giver's heart to their hand, where, when the heart becomes opened, the hand then naturally follows. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that people won't give through this approach to the general fund, because they absolutely will. But when you start to think of through an estate type gift, which is really what we're asking people to do, that's a big psychological shift from what they normally would have been taught and or have been historically doing, where they're giving from their income. So that becomes a little more personal for them, and they want to attach to it at a much deeper level.
Right. So David, we got some data from Cygnus Applied Research that we discussed in the blog post that we gave earlier this month, and some of those statistics may not be real surprising. One of the things, though, that I was kind of curious about was the impact of donor fatigue in the church-centric model versus the giver-centric model. In fact, if I'm looking at the research here that we put in our blog post, it says that less than 10% of givers will respond to more than 5 major asks or campaigns. And I think that, you know, as someone who was a pastor for 35 years, I think we all have had experience from time to time around donor fatigue. We understand what donor fatigue does. How can using this approach of giver-centric philanthropy maybe soften that impact of donor fatigue that happens when we just constantly have an ask to catch up on our general budget, or we have just continuous capital campaigns?
If you want to look at how to avoid donor fatigue, you have to look at what our peers would be doing. And I say our peers, I would say higher education. So colleges and universities, how do they fundraise, for lack of a better word? How do major hospitals, that segment being health and human services, how do they fundraise? Well, there's a journey that they take every giver on. And that giver, that journey, typically you can think about it as a base of a pyramid where they want to talk about their estate with a testamentary gift. That really doesn't do anything today other than it's a big psychological shift. When someone includes the church in their trust or their will, that is a big shift. It's a mind shift because now the church is part of the family, for lack of a better word, because that's who is usually reserved in those planning documents. So if we want to take someone on that journey, it's a testamentary gift, then maybe a split interest gift, and then an outright gift of assets. So that's the journey we want to think about with every one of our givers as we think through donor-centered philanthropy. Hey, what do you care about? What can you leave in the estate? And then once you think about the fatigue pieces of that, and by the way, donor fatigue largely comes in because churches are funded by 30% or so of the donors who have to do the heavy lift, whether it be in a capital campaign or annual giving. So to broaden that, you need to think through, okay, how do we talk to people that have assets who have stewarded well? And how can we get them to give from their assets rather than just their income? And then by doing so, there will be gifts that people say, hey, I want to do this, but I can't part with this asset. Therein lies the fatigue piece. And the gap or the stopgap piece of that becomes, say, what we call a split interest gift or a life income gift. That is one of the strategies that we would want you to teach you, which, quite frankly, our peers, nonprofits, non-faith nonprofits have been doing for decades, and they're quite literally cleaning up the floor, for lack of a better word, as it relates to outpacing the growth in their funding. And they're doing it by way of teaching people not only how to give from their assets, but then also how to give a life income gift or a split interest gift that really perpetuates or reduces the effects of donor fatigue.
That's awesome. So again, for those of you who are watching our webinar live, we would encourage you to put any questions you have in the chat channel, and Nikki's going to help us monitor those, and we will have a time of Q&A at the conclusion of our presentation today. So feel free to go ahead and put your questions or comments in the chat. So David, let's talk through 5 of the key shifts that we need to make in order to make the transition from being strictly a church-centric approach to more of a broad giver-centric approach to philanthropy and charitable giving. The first shift that churches need to think through is to build a legacy impact ministry through the discipleship lens. And one of the things that we commonly say around Mortarstone is we want something for you and not something from you. So talk to us a little bit about how and why is it important to build a legacy impact ministry, and how it then becomes a discipleship model instead of maybe strictly a fundraising model.
Yeah. So as we think through donor fatigue, I'll just continue on that concept. What we want to do is broaden how we are funded as a church. And in so doing, that becomes who else can we be talking to that has the ability to kind of upgrade their giving, if you will. In our vernacular, we use giving bands. How do we take a band one giver, a low level giver, and make them a top giver? Or a band three giver or a band four giver. That's kind of the journey, if you will, kind of a giving ladder, if you will. But we have defined this through what we like to think of is a necessary ministry that every church should have, but few do. And it's called the Legacy Impact Ministry. And as you so eloquently said, Tim, it's what we want for you, not from you in this stage of life. And so think of it as a life stage ministry. We're looking for those that are 55 years old or older that have good tenure with the church. In other words, have been giving for a long time. And by default, they've mastered the ability to steward or manage what God's entrusted to them. Now, they haven't been taught how to live generous with that. That's kind of the big piece. And then how do you live generous with that to, in essence, create your legacy and really kind of grow your impact, not only in the church, but outside of the church as well. And that becomes the framework of a legacy impact ministry. How do we talk to those that have stewarded well about the generosity component? What do we want for you, not from you in this life stage, if you will? And so that's how we would discuss or think through one of the gaps in most churches. Because if you think about most churches, they do stewardship well. They have, whether it's Crown Ministries or Financial Peace University with Dave Ramsey, they do a budgeting class and they get people prepared for that. Some churches do wills and trust, which is great. But for the most part, that's probably going to be segmented towards a younger demographic. Most people who have assets probably have their own estate attorney. The gap that we're seeing is the 55 to 60 plus year olds have assets, but they have not been taught how to think through those assets as it relates to their legacy.
And I think that's really important because that kind of shifts the conversation from being fundraisers to faith raisers. And I know there are pastors and church leaders across the nation who are a little bit anxious about talking about money. They're concerned about it because they feel like they're, asking for money or fundraising, and it's uncomfortable. But this gives us an opportunity, David, it sounds like, to be able to talk about generosity without the ask and to be able to really focus on those discipleship components, which is really something our churches, ought to be focused on. Now, as we think about legacy impact ministry, David, there's 2 or 3 things that we think are important parts of a legacy impact ministry. For example, do you have a generosity plan? What are those 3 things that we think that you think would be a real important part of a legacy impact ministry to kind of create some context around this statement?
Yeah. So we like to think when we talk about the legacy impact ministry, again, it's not another commitment by any stretch. It's rather a life stage. And so those that have stewarded well, those are the people we want to be talking to. And what do we want for you in this stage of your life? Like Tim said, we want you to create a generosity plan, first and foremost. Rarely do things happen for the good without a plan. We want people to think through 2 critical questions. Am I content and am I secure? Those are really the hallmarks of where we want to go. Am I content and am I secure? Contentment means I just got a windfall of money. Do I need to go buy a bigger home? Or do I need to buy a new car? Or do I need to fill in the blank? Continue to escalate my lifestyle. And then secure, which basically is, hey, am I placing my trust in God, or am I tracing it in my financial possession, my money, if you will? Those are 2 discipleship issues around contentment and security that the church really needs to help their givers think through. And that third piece of this is, how do I want to help my heirs? And that becomes a function of, and we could change how we say that. How rich do I want to make my heirs? And I think one of the classic statements about that, several very wealthy people have said, one in particular comes to mind is Warren Buffett. Back in 1986, so I'm going way back now, back in 1986, someone said, how much money you're going to give your heirs? And he goes, I want to give my children enough money so that they can feel like they can do anything, but not so much money that they don't do anything, right? So we want to help our kids, but we don't want to ruin our kids. And that's largely not a conversation that's had in what we call secular planning. So those three elements, a generosity plan, contentment and security, how much do we want to enrich our kids, or how much do we want to enrich their lifestyle? And then what am I going to do with what's left over? That leftover piece really becomes the function of putting generosity into motion today.
Excellent. So the first application here to make the transition is to build a legacy impact ministry through a discipleship lens. The second is to develop a strong case for support. So David, talk to us a little bit about what we mean when we say that a church needs to have a strong case for support.
Yeah, very few churches have defined the problem that they want to solve, that their ministry is there for, other than we want to teach people about Jesus. Very admirable. That's awesome. And for an income-based gift, that's usually all it takes. But to go a step deeper into someone's estate giving to perpetuate a ministry, we need to think about overarching the bigger problem that we're trying to solve for. Mission statements, albeit good intent, if you will, they focus on making more and better disciples rather than some of the key areas they're trying to eradicate or to reduce. And that's something that a case for support does very, very well. But few churches have quantified what they're trying to accomplish in their ministry. They haven't thought through what the cost is, and they haven't thought through when they achieve it. And that's something that people that will give from their estate, they want to be able to see that. What's the problem? What do we need to solve it? And then I can start to take action to help become a partner, for lack of a better word, to solve that issue. Churches have to do a better job of quantifying their ministry impact with multiple metrics or multiple lanes, if you will, that people can think through. I can peel off a sizable or a major gift to my estate if this will help achieve fill in the blank.
Right. So David, this I think is really important for you to speak into, because I know that church leaders like myself are really concerned about, or hesitant, I should say, about giving that kind of freedom to givers to be able to speak into their gift a little bit, what we would call giver intent or donor intent. And I know that, there is that concern that, hey, we don't want the tail to wag the dog. We don't want someone to control the direction of the church. What's a good way for us to think through that hesitancy or that concern?
Yeah. And probably the easiest way that I've been taught to think through this is through kind of a restaurant menu idea. When we go out to eat, we first kind of pick a restaurant that we want to attend to. When we go to the restaurant, they then give us a menu that we can order from, and then they prepare a dish that is basically akin to what they're able to produce. In other words, we're probably not going to go to Texas Roadhouse, where they specialize in meat or chicken or fish, and order a sushi roll. It's probably not on the menu. They're probably not prepared to make it. Therefore, it's not even something we're going to think about. So when you think about your case for support, you should be thinking about the 3 or 4 or 5 things that the ministry is predominantly about. And that becomes your project lanes, your project funding lanes that people can then attach to. For example, you might have some debt that you want to get rid of. Well, as a business person, I know the effects of debt, and I might get excited about thinking through, how can I help the church get debt free? That might be something I can get passionate about. Conversely, you might have somebody that was from a broken family, and they had to raise their kids independent of themselves, or independent of a spouse, I should say. And they might have really a heartfelt need to help the less fortunate single mothers, single parents, if you will, where they can then lean into those children and make sure that their needs are met. Those are ministry lanes or ministry priorities that most churches will have identified, but they haven't then thought through or quantified what they need to really solve that problem. And ultimately, the bigger the church gets, the bigger the solution becomes. So it's like, you're never really going to outgrow it, but we do need to like start to take steps to quantify it and identify it. Because again, you don't want the donor directing the ministry's vision, for lack of a better word, by not having a properly defined case for support.
Excellent. I think that's a great answer. And I think that'll help clarify our thinking a little bit about some of those hesitancies that we might have when we start talking about giver intent with the gifts that they give, especially from assets. The third point was to play the long game. Talk to me a little bit about why it's important for us to go into a legacy impact ministry focused on giver-centric philanthropy. Why is patience an important piece?
Well, typically a planned gift, and let me digress, a plan by definition, and this is our definition, it's probably not the industry's definition, for lack of a better word, but a planned gift is any gift that requires a third party to facilitate. So think about that just for a second. A planned gift might involve the need for a tax professional, a financial advisor, a family lawyer. Those are the types of gifts that we want people to think through, and that's why it's called a planned gift. There's several gifts we're working with right now. Case in point, there's a lady that we're working with in Arizona who purchased a lot several years ago. She doesn't need it. She doesn't want to technically sell it and pay the capital gains. What is she going to do with it? Well, she wants to donate it. And so the person who said, yeah, you can afford to do this, was their tax professional, and then ultimately their family lawyer who got involved to draft the necessary documents to convey the asset to the church. So that's kind of what you want to be thinking through with a planned gift. It usually involves a third party. Now, contrast that with a simple cash gift. That becomes a function of, hey, I just got paid. I got $5,000 in my checking account. I can give $500. That's simple math. That's what the church typically teaches with the tithe. Nothing wrong with that. But when we start thinking about giving from assets, it usually becomes a more complex discussion, which usually takes more time to start to ferret that out and help people understand what the benefits are. Two best times to do that, spring and fall. The reason is that's tax time. So that sense of, hey, I have a massive tax bill, how do I diminish that? That becomes, well, you might want to think through parting with a major gift. Take that charitable deduction for the current year plus 5 more as a roll carry forward. That becomes the essence of a planned gift.
And I think what you said is good, because as I think through end of year giving strategies, typically that's something we hit in the month of December. And if the need is for a large tax deduction, we might want to think about backing up that end of year giving strategy to October or something like that, to be able to allow time for these, non-cash assets to be given. Because you're right, it's not a conversation, it's not a Zoom call. It takes time for some of those gifts to come through, because there's a lot of moving parts, right?
Yeah, and I will contrast this to traditional annual gifts. If you've ever done a capital campaign, one of the first things that you do is your consultant or your church leadership team will pull a list of givers that have given to the church. And they usually have some threshold, a minimum threshold. And that becomes one of the first things that they will do as a church setting up a major gift strategy is, let's go talk to some of our major givers, cast vision, and see if they'll get behind it. That is relationship capital that usually only is fostered through a capital campaign. donor-centered philanthropy, not only does that require that, but that's an ongoing strategy. You want to get to know your people if you're ever going to be able to have confidence to ask them for an estate gift.
And that folds perfectly into the fourth point, which is think personal, not platform. And a lot of times with our fundraising models, we'll want to think, well, we'll just cast a broad net over the masses, and then we'll harvest something from the broadcast of the net. But this is something that's more personal. As our friend at Oxano, Brian Rose, likes to say, the whites of their eyes matter. So what would it take, say, for example, David, that you're my pastor, or you're my executive pastor, or my stewardship minister, and I'm one of your faithful givers in your church. What might you do to approach me with this giver-centric philosophy? What would that conversation look like?
And well, this is the beauty of it. Since there's not necessarily a campaign or an campaign on the horizon, it's so much easier to meet with people when you don't have a quote unquote agenda, if that makes sense. In other words, that takes the guard down, takes the anxiety down, that both pastor and donor will have. Like, hey, why is my pastor wanting to meet with me? What's he want, right? Well, if you're not doing that regularly, that's usually what they think. If this becomes a regular call, it's like, hey, I get to go to lunch with my pastor this week, and I get to, share with him what's going on in my life, or he can pray for me with fill in the blank. I can pray for him. Pastor, what can I help you accomplish? So when you think about this approach, it's so much easier than if you're trying to fund a capital campaign. Not to say that capital campaigns are hard or bad, they're just different, right? It's a different approach. So when you think about this becomes very personal, and it becomes a deeper relationship that pastors need to start to foster and build over the long haul. Again, these gifts take time to be flushed out. They just don't happen overnight, but they're massively opportunistic when you have people shift how they think about looking at their balance sheet and thinking about their taxes when it comes time to their generosity and their giving.
Right. I like to think of major gifts, David, as stop and think about it gifts.
Yeah.
That may not, translate into a specific dollar amount, but if I have to stop and think about it, then that's going to be something that takes time. And the trust relationship that we have in our relationship between church leader and member really is going to not only go a long way to help foster those gifts or those kinds of gifts from assets, but also the potential to renew those gifts so that I'm able to, begin doing this as a lifestyle and not a one-time thing because I signed a pledge card and, I checked the box by the end of 24 or 36 months. The final piece of this, David, is recognize the value of legacy language. And we love words at Mortarstone like legacy and heritage. How do we leverage the value of that kind of language as we try to build out these relationships with our givers?
Yeah, everyone wants their life to matter, right? That's just like, hey, we don't want to go through life, and then at the end, it's like, oh yeah, 20 years down the road, I forgot who that person was, or 5 years, or 12 months. We want our lives to matter. God placed us here with a purpose and vision to impact those around us, to speak into those people. And so I think it's natural to think everybody's going to want a legacy. And that's what we teach, is not only your legacy is going to be developed as you start to transfer not only your values, but also your valuables. And I think you say that better than anyone. And it becomes almost like something I would parrot, but really when you combine values and valuables, that then becomes your legacy, right? And so I think it's important to know that everybody, as they start to age in life, they're thinking through different things. and I'm going to deviate from script here a little bit. As I was getting dressed this morning, I saw a pair of swim trunks in my closet. And as I was thinking about those swim trunks, it became, what am I thinking about swim trunks for? It's snowing outside, right? How many people, show of hands, are thinking about wearing swim trunks today? Probably not a lot of people, but we planned to do something over spring break. Therefore, my wife came home with a pair of swim trunks for me to try on in advance of our trip. I say that to say, we might not be thinking about legacy, but your 60-year-olds, your 70-year-olds, your 80-year-olds, they're thinking about their legacy. And so it's incumbent on us to say, yeah, this might not be what I'm thinking about, but this life stage, people are. And as Tim would say, or as we try and teach our churches and our givers to think about it, don't just transfer your values or your valuables, transfer your valuables with your values. And that's a process that is taught. It's not just automatically done.
Great. So David, as we review these 5, suggestions on how to make the transition, are there any particular calls to action or ways that we can be helpful to the people who are viewing our webinar today?
Yeah.
Are there some of those that we can offer to be of assistance?
Yeah. First and foremost, if you have a stewardship and generosity ministry, I would love to look at your playbook. I'd love to see what you've thought through, what you're trying to accomplish with that. So if you would send me a link or a document, we would love to be able to speak into that with you to say, hey, have you thought about fill in the blank? Or what can you be teaching us that we can then impart to others as well? So that would be my first challenge, if you will, is let's collaborate on what stewardship and generosity ministries look like. And if you don't have a playbook, reach out to us. We can show you what we have garnered and learned and developed by working with churches for the last 12 years, I guess it is now. Secondarily, your case for support. Send me your link of your mission statement on your church so that we can then speak into it and say, have you thought about fill in the blank? Because I think one of the best things that you can do is contrast your mission statement with that of, say, Habitat for Humanity or even Compassion International. Those are 2 well-respected, well-thought of ministries that a lot of churches will invite them in so that they can, quote unquote, partner with your people to either adopt a child or help fund, housing, if you will. But look at both those websites. In fact, you can actually Google it. Google Case for Support, Habitat for Humanity. Contrast that to how you're sharing what your vision is and your need is for what you're trying to accomplish in your church. Those are my 2 big takeaway items.
Okay, excellent. So David, we've got a couple of questions in the chat that we want to address. And again, if you're viewing this live with us today, please feel free to drop those questions in the chat box so that we can look at them. The first question I can answer. The question is, who teaches the classes that you talked about in a legacy ministry? The answer to that question is generally me. What I do is I come into a church and we offer 5 different workshops to help educate your givers around particular concerns. One is, how do you plan a legacy design for your life so that it has impact? The personal legacy design workshop. The second one is tax smart giving, because we believe that there's a way for churches to be able to educate and disciple their givers around how to make tax smart gifts. We do offer a wills and trusts workshop that helps people figure out what they need to do in order to develop a will or a trust. And that gets into estate design, which leads to estate planning, which is the legal documents. Then the 4th seminar we do or workshop is called the Charitable Gift Toolbox, where we break down about 17 or so charitable gift tools that we can help utilize to give three kinds of gifts. The first gift is a gift that helps now. The second is a gift that helps later, which is a deferred gift like a will or a bequest. And the third is a gift that produces income, which is a life income or a split interest gift. The final workshop is called Raising Literate Heirs, because we realize that it's really important for our older people, 16 above, who have planning documents in place. How are they then going to prepare their heirs to receive what they're going to get? So that would be the answer to that question. 5 workshops, and David and I team teach those sometimes, but generally it would be me. David, the second question is, what does a conversation look like with a top donor? How do you build a relationship with kind of that 1%er? How do you build a relationship with them without looking like you're trying to set them up for an ask? And we talked about this just a little bit, but maybe if we could circle back for a minute and talk about how do we really not just talk to our givers, but our top donors?
Well, I think I think there's clear language. In fact, there's a gentleman we work with. His name's Dr. Russell James, and he's writing his a new book that he's going to release, and it's going to be called basically the Church-Based Fundraiser. And the premise behind this book is in 2 or 3 scriptures: 1 Timothy 6:17 through 19. This one scripture is specifically written towards the charge, if you will, to command those who are rich to live generously towards God. That's going to culminate in about a 120,000 page book. But I think we are charged to talk to those with means. It's clear in scripture that we're supposed to be doing this, but are we? And are we doing it for what we want from them or what we want for them in this? And that's where this becomes so powerful, is we do not have, we don't do capital campaigns. So it's easy to say, hey, we want to meet with you just to talk about the things that you're grateful for and what God's done for you and how you might be able to have a lasting legacy or impact with what you steward for him. That's a very easy conversation because there's not ever a solicitation. It's just casting vision and allowing God to work in their hearts to see what they can do. And what you are mentioning in those workshops, that's the impetus behind the trigger point, if you will, to make the gift. That tax smart giving. Hey, I'm going to sell an asset and I'm going to be taxed on it. You know, we have a philanthropic partner that we don't typically think about called the IRS. They come into our pocket when we earn it. They come into our pocket when we invest in it, and then we come into our pocket when we transfer it. They have their rule book down, and we don't as a church. And that's incumbent on us to teach people with means how to have a charitable strategy so that they can direct those tax dollars to the cause of Christ. That becomes a more simple conversation than it would normally be with like, hey, we need a lead giver to fill in the blank.
Right. A lot of pressure is taken off the conversation when we don't have a goal and a deadline. Mm-hmm. And the goal and the deadline really kind of elevates the pressure. And I was talking with someone yesterday. We were talking about, the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter of a football game. And, sometimes I feel like, when we think about educating our people about giving, we're 2 minutes on the clock and we're on our own 10-yard line. And before you know it, we're trying to throw the ball as far as we can into the end zone, hoping somebody with the right colored jersey comes down because we're on the clock and we're down 6. But there is a way, if we do giver-centric philanthropy right, that when we get to the fourth quarter, we can be up 3 touchdowns. And if we get the ball with 2 minutes left, we're just going into victory formation and taking a knee. right? So this is something that I think really helps our givers to know that they feel the pressure of the deadline and the goal, just like we feel the pressure of accomplishing the deadline and the goal. And so I think that's a great insight. So David, before we wrap this up and bring it to a close, would you mind taking a minute and talking about the Legacy Impact Summit that we're doing at Edgewood in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, August 1, 2, and 3. Would you be willing to just describe that a little bit for our viewers today?
Yeah, as we talked about on today's call, the Legacy Impact Ministry, where we are driving this is we think this should culminate with a Legacy Impact Summit, for lack of a better word. So we wanted to gather our church partners, as well as our givers, in a beautiful atmosphere to where we can really get educated with some of the headwinds, challenges, et cetera, that we see in philanthropy. Case in point, I'm going to share this real quick. Over 40 plus years, the total percentage of giving to the churches that have been on a decline. So when you look at philanthropy as a whole, it's a smaller and smaller piece of the total budget that's going to faith-based organizations. That's a 40 plus year trend. That's something we need to be aware of, and teaching others to be aware of that as well. So we want to get together and educate. The other piece of that is we want to be able to recreate together. What I mean by that is the best form of donor-centered philanthropy happens within relationship. And so within those relationships, we want to be able to play golf together. We want to be able to maybe go on a boat cruise together. And then we want to do that with our peers. And so that's the other piece of that is we want to bring pastors and leaders together so that we can educate, we can recreate, and then celebrate. That's kind of that third leg, if you will, is we want to be able to praise God for what's going on in the local churches, as well as our individual givers' lives. And we want to do that corporately. And so we're putting together what we call the Legacy Impact Summit. We have some fantastic speakers. Lee Doming, Church of the Highlands, Kingdom Builders, Chris Gillard from Saddleback. We also have a gentleman in Jeff from Christ Church of the Valley in Peoria. For those of you who don't know that church, it's just a massive, massive ministry. And then we also have some what I would term professionals. So we have that gentleman, Dr. Russell James from Texas Tech University, who's going to be able to put a spin into what we should be thinking through. And yours truly, myself and Tim Dietrich will be there as well. So 3 days, 2 nights of living really in one of the most beautiful places that I'm aware of. Lake Tahoe is my backyard, but we're at elevation of about 6,500 feet with an alpine lake. And we want to really enjoy God's beauty and get educated and continue to live generously together.
So Nikki's going to put in the chat the website, so for you to be able to find more information about that Legacy Impact Summit. And David, I really like the idea of the celebration element of that, just simply because, believe it or not, some of the most marginalized people in our churches are our top givers. You know, the Bible says that we're to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. And historically, the church has been really good about running to the rescue to those who weep. But we really have a hard time celebrating the successes, rejoicing with those who are rejoicing. And so having the opportunity to bring top givers from several churches together will create an incredible networking opportunity and allow your top donors to have the opportunity to connect with people who are in the same life stage, if you will, to build affinity. Because a lot of times the loneliest people in your church are your wealthiest people. So we want to thank you for taking the time to come and join with us today on this month's Mortarstone webinar. We want to go ahead and share with you that our next webinar is going to be Thursday, March 23 at 2 o'clock Central. Our subject is going to be women in philanthropy. Did you know that March is Women's History Month? Did you know that by 2030, women will own 2/3 of all of our nation's resources?
That's like how long from now, Tim? I think this is pretty amazing.
7 years.
We're not taking 20 years. We're talking like it's
Yeah.
around the corner, right?
Yeah,
And that's largely what the silent generation and the boomers are, statistically males die younger than females. And so who's going to inherit that wealth, right? That's
Right.
really going to be impactful.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're finding is churches really struggle with how to engage women. Yet 40% of women in America out earn their husbands. So this is an important demographic for us to be able to reach into. And so be watching your inbox for our next blog on women in philanthropy, and then mark the date for the next webinar on March 23. Our special guests that day are going to be Jess Furlong from Northridge Church in Plymouth, Michigan, and Kevin Kozadowski from Hosanna Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They're going to come and really help us understand how we can better engage women in philanthropy. So again, thank you for being here. David, before we close this call, do you have a good word of encouragement? You're such an encouragement to the churches we work with. And if I'm being honest, to our viewers, I don't know of anyone, I just don't know of anyone who has not ever served on the staff of a church who has a greater heart for generosity in the local church than David Thurman. And I don't just say that because he's my boss. I just think that his actions can clearly defend that statement. But David, you're such an encourager to me and to others and to our churches. Do you have a good word of encouragement for us today, especially around the giver-centric philanthropy?
Well, Tim, you're too kind, first and foremost. You're always are full of flattery, and I sure appreciate you for that. But yeah, and maybe it's because I have never been on staff at a church that I'm so endeared to the church, because I've not been a part of the insanity. Sometimes, it's hard work, right? We're constantly pushing towards deadlines, events, fill in the blank. We're usually understaffed. It's difficult work. And I have not had that opportunity to sit in that seat. Maybe God's protected me from that because maybe I don't have the patience for it. I don't know. But my word of counsel, my word of support for all of you is you do a fantastic job. So many churches we engage with, you guys have the right heart behind ministry. You're wanting to learn, which to me is invaluable. So stay learning. Stay curious. If you don't have a legacy impact type ministry, let us know. Let us talk with you and see what we can do to kind of help create that framework at your local church. And just keep championing the charge of what you're doing. I do believe the local church is the hope of the world. And I also believe it's going to be persecuted more and more in the coming years. Because that's what Satan does, right? He goes after the thing that's of good, and that church is of good. It provides such a good social net for our communities, and so much the things that they do locally and abroad. So keep the charge, keep the faith, and whatever we can do to support you, that's our heart as a company, as a ministry. That's what we want to do with you.
All right. Well, everyone, God bless. Have a great rest of the afternoon. We'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for joining.